to welcome you to the YAF. My name is Pete Henderson. I'm Assistant Director of Research at the Youth Endowment Fund. I'm really excited today to welcome Graham Farrell and Toby Davies to the YAF and say a big thank you to them for joining us. Graham is a Professor of Crime Science at Leeds University. He's an expert in situational crime prevention. He's published on a huge range of topics, but a recent focus has been the International Crime Drop. And in 2023, Graham was presented with the Ronald V. Clark Award for fundamental contributions to environmental criminology and crime analysis. And we're also joined by Toby Davies, who's an associate professor in criminal justice, data analytics, also at Leeds. Toby's work is strikingly interdisciplinary. He's published in criminology, maths, network science, and physics. But alongside his research, he's also been working with crime prevention agencies across the UK to translate research into practice. So fantastic to welcome both of them today. I think there's a huge amount that we could have asked Graham and Toby to speak to us all about. But they published a fascinating paper recently advocating for the banning of sharp-pointed knives. So yeah, really excited to hear more on this topic. I'll hand over to Graham and Toby.
Thank you, Pete. It's going to be mostly me talking, probably for about half an hour. I do a lot of talking, so I'm happy for people to interrupt if something stops making sense or for key technical questions. And then I know we'll have time for broader substantive questions at the end. And I think you'll be allowed to put questions in the chat as well. So last year, Toby and I wrote a short piece in the, so I've been researching on situational crime prevention for 30 or 35 years or so. And that's my background. I'll come back to that a little as a theoretical case for banning pointed knives. Last year, Toby and I wrote a general piece about knife crime prevention for the conversation, and then an academic journal article on which the work here is a slight update. Then we published another piece in the conversation that summarised a lot of this work that came out in January, which is when, since that time, the notion of a ban on pointed knives has got into the media conversation quite a bit more. So I've been really interested in getting feedback from people who are here on what you think, on how the work might be improved, on next steps, criticisms, and so on. So I really would like, we want to carry on this work and to, I think, pursue the case for banning pointed knives, really. I think we really do think it will be effective. So can we put the next slide on, please, Pete? So this is a summary of what we think the impact will be if we ban pointed knives. And by pointed knives, talking primarily about kitchen knives. I'll go on to tell you why. I think it will halve homicide rates. These are our evidence-based conclusions, what I expect. Halving of homicide rates related to knife crime, the use of knives. Reduced knife crime overall. Less knife carrying, and also in addition there'll be a prevention of thousands, tens of thousands of injuries that occur with pointed knives. Next slide, please. So this is the structure of what we're going to go through in the next half hour. I'm going to first outline the extent and nature of the knife crime problem. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the theoretical context and why I'm an optimist in relation to crime prevention generally. I think there's lots of things we can do, and I think there's lots of evidence showing we have been successful. It's not necessarily widely known, and I think we have a general approach that works as well. Then we'll go do briefly the UK strategy. So I'm optimistic about crime prevention because we've had up to 90% reductions over 30 years in things like car crime, burglary, and violent crime generally, and with knife crime being one of the exceptions. I'll then talk about the UK prevention strategy and how it has evolved in recent years. We have lots of policing strategies. We have violence reduction units. These haven't shown tremendous effectiveness. What we also have in parallel is a gradual ratcheting up of measures to control knives. And what we do know is that weapon control works. If you compare, we know this from gun violence in particular, where the UK compared to the US is remarkable, the effectiveness of gun control strategies. And there is good reason to expect the same if we can control knives effectively. So I'll move on to talk what's listed here as section 4 about how we should go about it as a phased approach to gradually allow markets to adapt. It's quite a big change in people's lives to expect people in their kitchens and elsewhere to use round tip knives. And I'll introduce that for discussion, and then I'll talk about impact. In particular, I'll focus on issues of displacement and diffusion and benefits. When Toby and I have published these works and posted it on social media, we've had a range of criticisms, and generally they group into this area of what are called displacement. Will offenders just use an alternative weapon? Will they manufacture a sharp weapon if they can do it? And to which our answer is no, largely it will not. And this is I'll talk you through the evidence for why we think that. And I'll conclude with further research. So that's where we're going. Next slide, please. This is a summary. To many of you, you probably know this already, but it's the background. In the 2010s in particular, there was a significant increase in knife crime to the extent we know. These are the 3 main indicators available. Usually we would use the crime survey for England and Wales as the best available indicator, but the numbers relating to knife-related offences are relatively small. So the best indicators are police recorded knife offences, homicides, which are almost all reported, and hospital episodes. And the trends in all 3 are quite similar, with this dramatic increase in the 2010s of about 85% overall. So this is the reason that knife crime is in the news so much. Knife crime homicides are, as I'll show you in a moment, a large proportion of all homicides. Homicide is tremendously costly for society. So the issue of knife crime has been identified because although they seem numerically small, a lot of the crimes and other knife-related crimes, threats, injuries, robberies, and so on are tremendously serious crimes. Next one, please. So this is the recent data from the Office for National Statistics that just came out a few weeks ago, which shows a breakdown of the overall type of weapon used in homicides. I can't use my pointer on here. If my pointer worked, because Peter is running the slides, if my pointer worked, I would circle the sharp instruments, which is that's the knife crime. So 46% of homicides in 2023 to 24, which is the year to March 2024. That's the most recent data. Were 46% of homicides using knife. But also look over at the left side where there's the light blue area that says shooting, 4%. So in that year in England and Wales, there were 22 shootings. That's gun-related homicides. And I remember that because I'm going to come back to that. So the largest type of weapon or means of homicide overall by far is a knife. Then the next chart. This shows that those proportions have remained fairly stable over time. This is the last decade. Sharp instrument there in relation to the number of homicides at the top. And it has increased, as you can see, a lot of the increase in homicides was related to use of knives rather than other measures. You'll see a strange hump in there in the purple line, which is strangulations and asphyxiations. And that was when a lot of the victims of the Hillsborough disaster were included in the homicide statistics, even though it was years and years after the original event. That was that jump. So the story is sharpish with knives consistently the weapon of choice for homicide in England and Wales. Next one. And that's the same data translated into percentage. So the percentage over time hasn't changed that much. That little blip was when the Hillsborough disaster victims were included. Around 40, now 45%, just over in the most recent data of all homicides in England and Wales use a knife of some sort. Now, this is all types of knives. And if you look at, if you watch the media, as all of you do, you would think it is zombie knives. And in fact, I did I looked just at the news articles published in the BBC, and in 2024, there were over 40 news items about zombie knives, and there were 4 news items about kitchen knives. And I suspect anyone, if they didn't know the slides that are following, would think that most knife crime, and particularly serious knife crime, uses zombie knives. Next slide, please. This is the types of knives used in those knife-related homicides that we just looked at. And what you see is, at the top, we've got, click it once more, Peter, please. There we go. Those are kitchen knives, which accounted for, in the 2 most recent years, just over half of all knife-related homicides, and there is zombie knives. And the first time I saw that, it was a shocker. Because you would think from the news items that zombie knives were dominated the picture of overall knife crime. What I don't have, and one of the other areas where we'd like to do further research, will be to look at other types of crime using police crime data, where I suspect we'll be able to tease out the involvement of different types of knives. But I suspect it's not dissimilar, and that kitchen knives will dominate, contrary to a lot of the news. There's something about zombie knives, perhaps the style, their ornateness, the term zombie being very popular in the media and films and things, that means it seems to grab the headlines. And in fact, knife crime is much more mundane, I would say. So that to me was one of the major findings, shall I say. This was data that has only recently come out, been released by the ONS. So this is the first time the data on the type of knife used has been available. It came out last year. There's now 2 years of data on there. So next slide, please. So let's go back a bit, rewound to the big picture for why we think that this approach to tackling knife crime will work, to the theoretical context. And the work I've been involved in for many years now has been looking at the long-term declines in many types of crime, not just in England and Wales, but internationally, in North America, the US and Canada, in most of Western Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, all high-income countries. And I can explain why not other countries, but we won't go into that today. There's been these similarly large and long-term declines in these types of crimes. So that chart there is data from the Crime Survey for England and Wales, and it shows that by 2023 there were close to 90% reductions in burglary, vehicle-related theft, and violence. There have been many explanations upward, but I think the leading explanation is one I've been fortunate to work on with many colleagues, is about the improvements in security. So vehicles is the flagship example, where it's now very difficult. You used to be able to break into a vehicle in a few seconds in the 1980s, get through the door and hotwire it also in a few seconds. Nowadays, you can't get into a vehicle. They've got extremely good locks, and even if you can, it's generally very difficult to start the engine because of vehicle immobilizers and a whole suite of security. So we've driven down many types of crime. So we should be optimistic about crime prevention, is my argument. We've done it, and we know that this approach of reducing crime opportunities, making it a little more difficult, can have tremendous effects. It requires you to think a little differently about crime, but it can be tremendously effective. So that's the broad picture of the background for the broad theoretical context: situational crime prevention, and the reduction of crime opportunities. The next, click once more. So the other component of the broader theoretical context is that we know that weapons control is effective. And again, the flagship example for this is a comparison of US gun control and gun control in the UK, where in the UK we have strict gun control, and in the US there is fairly widespread gun ownership and even the right to bear arms. You'll have heard the term in the Constitution. And this is why I asked you in the earlier slide to remember that 4% of homicides in England and Wales were gun related. There were people who were shot, and there was 22 in them. And if you don't know, try and guess to yourself. I'll tell you now how many gun-related homicides you think there were for the most recent year in the United States. The data I found from the Center for Disease Control, so 21,000 gun-related homicides. I think that was up to 2022. And also 26,000 gun-related suicides, 26,000 gun-related homicides. So there was 27. So in total, there was 47,000 gun-related deaths. There was actually more suicides than homicides, but 21,000 homicides. In the UK, there was 22. So it's fairly clear that weapon control works, and we just haven't realised it to the same extent for knife control. And this is why we think that controlling knives to a similar extent, which, as I'll explain, should become relatively normal, and just as gun control is, will be tremendously effective. Next slide, please. So we're moving now to control on knives. In fact, it's not new at all. Louis XIV, King of France, introduced a ban on pointed knives in dining rooms and in the street, assisted by Cardinal Richelieu, which is the second picture there, in 1669. I don't think there was I've not found a formal published evaluation, but I suspect it significantly reduced violence in the areas where it was introduced. But the general point is that this is not really a new idea. People have been banning knives because of violence and the threat they pose, pointed knives, for many years. Next slide. In fact, if you think about it, you use round-tipped knives all the time. In the dining room, in your dining room at home, in the cafeteria at work, in any cafe you go to, all of the table knives are round-tipped. And why is that? Next time you go, think about it. It's because it's an everyday crime prevention precaution that we take, and it's so normal that we barely recognise it. Imagine the amount of violence that would occur in dining rooms, restaurants, and also the number of injuries that would occur if table knives had pointed tips. You see the odd one now and again for steak knives, for instance, but they're specially distributed because we know they're so dangerous. So many types of knives already have these round tips. Our bread knives at home typically have a rounded tip because they're a large knife. It would be more like a sword if your bread knife had a pointed tip. We have two bread knives and they both have the curved end. So what I'm saying is that this is not only is it not a new idea, In fact, the notion of round tip knives is very common, extremely common. It's so mundane that we hardly recognize it. So the extra step we're recommending, particularly when we go through the recent history of developments in controlling knives, is not a major step, really. Next one, please. These are some examples of safer knives. The picture on the left there, that's a photograph of a steak knife at Glasgow Airport, where airports are perhaps a particular instance where safety has become much more of an issue because of the threat to airlines and hijacking. But that's an effective steak knife that is in use in airports. The pictures on the right are for our safe rounded kitchen knives. These are the knives that I have in my kitchen that we use. My wife and I use these. In fact, the bottom three of those are the ones we have, and the top one. We don't have the two in between, the two longer ones, because we have other bread knives already. But we've got rid of all our pointed knives and we use those, and they're absolutely fine. I think the correspondent from The Economist who recently wrote that said they are not bad, I believe. They're absolutely fine. He'd started using them too. I spoke to him. And as I'll go on to suggest, there's no real culinary reason why you need a pointed tip on a knife, or why you can't have a special tiny version if you do need a pointed tip. Next slide, please. This is research which informed the work we've been doing. I think it's pioneering research by Leisha Nichols-Drew and colleagues. Leisha's at University of Kiel and I think is on here today. And we've been talking about this area and a possible ban on pointed knives. And Leisha also suggested a ban on pointed knives based on her research. And this is brilliant research. I'll explain why. You see that matrix, it is there. And down on the left side, you've got t-shirt, jeans, jumper, leather skirt. So they tested different types of knives on different types of materials to see how much damage they did. And they used 5 types of knives. And there are some odd ones that I don't know much about, the R-shaped knife and the sheep's foot knife. But with the knife B, the second column there is a rounded knife, and knives and columns D and E. Knife D, the straight edge pointed knife, and the serrated edge pointed knife are the ones on the left. If you do one more click, Peter. One more. Sorry, I should have said 2. Those are the ones, those are the empirical examples from Leisha's research that show the huge difference in the amount of damage from a round tip knife and a pointed knife. Basically, little or no damage really from a round tip knife, a lot of damage from the pointed knife. The other knives are interesting because they do different degrees. They show that there is some gradation in between degrees of damage, but the straight edge pointed knives that you can see, that's the killer. That's what kills people. Rounded tip knives, yeah, they don't kill people. And I think it's the elegant simplicity of Leisha's research that I enjoyed, and that's why I first got in touch, because I read that, and it's brilliant to have, because without the empirical evidence to show that pointed knives are dangerous, rounded tip knives are not dangerous, people would not believe the arguments. They would say there's no evidence to show that pointed tip knives don't kill and that pointy ones do. And that's it. And that's why I think this research is fundamentally important. Thank you. Next one. So in recent years, in UK knife crime prevention strategy is evolved. I'm taking more time than expected, I apologize. Is developed. We have policing strategies and violence reduction units. They haven't to date shown tremendous success. A review of policing strategies doesn't show tremendous success. But what we have done is gradually increase the restrictions on knives and knife carrying. And the Offensive Weapons Act 2019 was the first to restrict the carrying of a kitchen knife in public. You cannot longer do that. And then in 2025, as you'll have seen, we have now further tightened regulations, particularly on online sales. So our argument is that a ban on pointed knives more generally is merely another incremental step in this existing policy strategy and movement that we already have. Next slide, please. So we're coming towards what I actually think is a very important component, which is the criticisms. Will people like it? Will people be able to use knives? Will offenders just use something else? And I'm actually very positive about all these things as well. A study, again, 20 years ago, Hearn et al. And colleagues published in the British Medical Journal, I believe, they conducted interviews with chefs who said, actually, there's no real reason for having long pointed knives. We don't really need them. We could use a 5 centimeter pointed knife, a tiny knife, if we actually need someone with a point. It's just historical reasons we have these long knives. The company Viners, whose knives I showed you earlier, they designed the safe knives. When they were designing those knives, and it was prompted by the 2019 Offensive Weapons Act, they consulted 1,700 people who said that they didn't experience any meaningful culinary drawbacks when using those knives rather than pointed tip knives. So I'd say there's no, and that's my experience from living with these knives now for months. They're absolutely fine. What I found is that what I now realize that what I mostly use pointed tip knives for was things like opening freezer bags and stabbing Amazon parcels to get them open and things like that, which you really shouldn't use them for anyway, which is probably a dangerous use of a pointed knife, and where you should use a more appropriate implement, the scissors for opening. I now use the scissors for opening freezer bags. Next slide, please. So we recommend a 4-stage implementation of a ban, consultation with stakeholders, retailers, manufacturers, customers, users of knives as well, to develop awareness, refine the plan, awareness campaigns. I always say to some extent these have started already with recent statements from Idris Elba, the Home Secretary saying she's now considering a ban, and the greater discussion of this in the news. Then a transition within the market. We need to work with retailers to gradually reduce stocks of pointed knives and promote alternatives, educational initiatives, moving towards incentives to promote compliance, and gradually towards a ban on sales of pointed knives. So they could still be sold while people still own them if we do this gradually. So it's a gradual process to allow this behavioral change. This is what psychologists call the shaping of behavior. This is how a lot of policies are implemented. The clearest example at the moment is the gradual, and this is taking decades, ban on the internal combustion engine. But if you think back, we did a similar phasing out of environmentally unfriendly light bulbs. And so there were various precedents for this. And then in stage 4, moving to full implementation, where this is relatively normal already, it's not a big surprise. We then have a deadline for a complete ban on pointed knives with enforcement mechanisms because they're dangerous, they kill people. And continue support for transition programs. So a phased implementation. Next slide, please. So these are the major criticisms, or I think they're humorous. When Toby and I posted some of this work online, we had people post replies like, "Oh, these offenders, they will haven't you heard of filing down a toothbrush, making a toothbrush shiv, or they'll just use something else." And the most common type of comment was that they'll just use something else, which is what's more formally known as crime displacement, specifically tactical displacement. There are different types of displacement. This one, where you shift the means of doing something, is known as tactical displacement. And so this seems to be it's a misconception, but it also seems to be a common knee-jerk reaction to this suggestion of a ban on pointed knives. Offenders will just use something else, and in fact, they won't. And even an old systematic review, a brilliant study, and a very famous study in criminology by Rob Garrett and Kate Bowers in 2009, found that tactical displacement of the type occurs only in 1 in 5 They only found it in 1 in 5 evaluations. And even within those, it was relatively minor. So even if you do get some displacement, you've still got a massive reduction in the crimes. And typically that type of displacement is probably not as damaging as the original crime that is no longer being committed. So it's a very positive picture, and I think there's a lot of misconception around this idea. Next slide, please. Consider the alternatives that are available. People say the types of things I've had is, people they'll use scissors, they use screwdrivers or bottles. In fact, when you think about this clearly, all of those alternatives, there's a reason that they're not used already. There's a reason that knives are the weapon of choice. And it's because kitchen knives are readily available. You've got lots of them. They're really easy to use as a weapon to kill someone, and they're tremendously effective. Scissors, less numerous. If it's like our house, we're all like, where's the scissors? They often have rounded tips already by design. They don't afford stabbing in the same way because they don't have the same handle. They're not as easy to use. Consider, gangs and that, they're not really going to carry scissors, I don't think. They don't have the same status. They're potentially being mocked. And it's the same story with slightly different nuances for different potential weapons. Screwdrivers are usually in the shed or the garage, so particularly for spur of the moment, heat of the moment violence, they're far less readily available. You don't carry screwdrivers as a status knife, really, or a status weapon. And generally, they will cause less damage. They can be dangerous, no doubt, but they're less dangerous than a pointed tip knives. Bottles, I think it's rare that people switch to bottles. A lot of the bottles we use nowadays are plastic or cardboard. They go, and glass ones go straight into the recycling, which are often not available. Bottles are also quite difficult to use. Stubbies, beer bottles you get a lot of nowadays, tiny, and using a bottle effectively without damaging yourself or wielding it as a weapon is actually quite tricky. You either need a lot of skill and experience or some good luck. So generally, most weapons are not suitable alternatives, and that's why we don't use them already a lot. Next slide, please. And to continue on that, just going back to guns, that's why we don't have thousands of homicides, because the gun control ban is effective and the crimes do not just displace. We have our rate of knife-related homicides in the UK is lower than the rate of knife-related homicides in the US. And I suspect that's because of the gun control ban allows us to also ban knives. There's a longer story there. Further research to be done. So the general barriers to weapon improvisation, will offenders just make alternatives? We had some people suggest they will use angle grinders, or they'll file down blunt knives to make weapons. That takes, you need tools to do that. You need to buy an angle grinder. They're quite expensive. You need some skills and knowledge, take a lot of time and effort. It makes your crime definitely premeditated. It makes it very different. And most offenders, particularly young offenders, they won't go to that time and effort to do that. Next slide, please. So we think that if you can ban pointed knives, it will reduce knife-related homicides by about half. There'll be, alongside with the other reductions in knives, it may even be more effective. And it will reduce knife crimes of different types overall. And we will get this tremendous reduction in knife-related injuries as well. These types of effects are called a diffusion of benefits, or positive spin-offs, or halo effects. It will actually extend further than we initially expected, rather than less. And then, I think it's the last slide. So I thought I'd end with suggestions for a research agenda. We definitely need more research in this area to build the evidence base, I think, and these are 4 broad areas. I think we need further research would use about which knives they choose and use and why, and the context of knife homicides. These have also been developed in discussion with Lisa Nichols-Drew, my colleague who is on the call, I believe. Knife selection in different situations, gang-related homicides versus domestic homicides for very different contexts. We need to break them down further. We need further evaluation of existing measures like knife replacement programs. Some police forces are trying to replacing pointed knives in households where there is a known risk of violence. They need proper evaluation. We need further evaluation of the effectiveness of online and offline sales practices. I think we could do secret shoppers. I read recently a BBC article of where they had been doing effectively a secret shopper strategy and buying weapons online, and it was very easy. We need to measure current levels of ownership through the Crime Survey in England and Wales, or an alternative household survey, so that we've got baseline measures so that we can measure change, because any policy change of the scale ought to be evaluated properly, and we need to move now to do baseline measures of what types of knives we have and use. We can also track these changes through manufacturing and sales as well, and a variety of other police data analysis about the use of knives in different crimes, and analysis of comparative weapons control policy. I think the UK is, I would say, probably close to the forefront in weapons control, but that we might learn more from comparison to other countries as well. And that concludes, and I hope I've taken 40 minutes exactly. I hope that leaves time for questions.
Thank you, Graham. That leaves plenty of time for questions. So if colleagues on the call would like to ask a question, please start putting up raise your virtual hand, and we can start queuing up the questions for Graham and Toby. While you're thinking of questions, I'll kick off with an initial question. And Graham, you mentioned at the start of the presentation that you expect that this could have an effect of halving homicides which involve knives as the weapon. And I was wondering if you could expand a bit on why you think it would have that particular effect. How do you arrive at an estimate of a reduction of half?
So it's simply the amount of, it's not rocket science, it's simply that's how much our pointed knives account for at the moment, kitchen knives, so half of knife-related homicides. So that's why I think it'll reduce it by half. Yeah. It was, not rocket science, best guesstimate. But experience really, I think, suggests that's what will happen. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Great. We've got a first question from Nick Madge. Nick, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you very much, Graham. Excellent presentation. Mine's not so much a question, more a contribution. I'm a retired circuit judge. I retired 7 years ago, and since then, because so many of the cases that I dealt with were serious stabbings, attempted murders, GBHs, which were actually committed with kitchen knives, I made a speech, and since then have been working along with other people, initially John Crichton, Duncan Bew, Leisha, who you mentioned, and we now call ourselves the Safer Knives Group, and we are in total agreement with what you've been saying. You've theoretically and with research come to almost identical conclusions that we've come to from our different practical backgrounds of a judge, a trauma surgeon, a psychiatrist, a forensic scientist. So absolutely excellent. Can I just make one or two incredibly quick points? One, in terms of the most recent stats, the most recent stats mean that 2 people are killed every week by kitchen knives. 2, if the other knives category in the stats, I think, like you do, is problematic. If you remove the other knives category because they're not identifiable, that means that the percentage of people who are killed by sharp-pointed items where they are kitchen knives goes up to 2/3. Thirdly, the point
Sorry, what was that? What made it go up to 2/3?
So if you remove the other knives category from the percentage,
Okay, yeah.
It stops being 52% that are killed by kitchen knives and goes up to 2/3 killed by kitchen knives.
Right,
So probably
yes.
the true stat is somewhere between 52% and 66%. So
Thank you,
it's even
yes.
stronger than the way you put it.
Yeah.
Thirdly, I never use the word weapon of choice, because so often it's not a choice, it's not a thought, it's the item which is most easily to hand, whether we're talking about teenagers, even 12-year-olds on the street, or whether we're talking about domestic violence, also when we're talking about self-harm and accidental things. Fourthly, as a group, we have been arguing for and are arguing through the medium of the debate about the police and crime bill that there should be a ban on sale by internet of pointed knives sent to residential premises. That we think is something which is far more achievable in the short term than the aim in the long term of a ban on pointed knives altogether. Next point, there are millions of pointed knives in kitchens. We applaud the progress of police forces in providing new rounded knives, but we're also identifying with high street retailers the possibility of incentives or even police working with retailers to round off existing knives so that existing pointed knives aren't wasted, they're simply converted into safer rounded knives. And the final I've spoken too much. Let me stop there. There are other points I could make, but I'll stop there.
Not at all, Nick. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you if I can. I've seen your work, and I apologise for not having mentioned you in the historical stuff of people who said this, because your name is very prominent in this area. So I'm flattered that you're here and gave supportive comments. Thank you very much.
We should all work together.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, those are very useful things. Thank you. I was making a list as you were speaking.
Thank you very much, Nick. Next question lined up is from Sharon Ward.
Hi there. I'm Sharon Ward. I'm the Serious Violence Duty Coordinator across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Really fascinating talk, really thought-provoking. A couple of points, really. I think, obviously, I absolutely agree with you. But the other points are around that kind of knowledge base, I suppose, around the ability to use a rounded knife for the public rather than a pointy knife, and trying to get that kind of message out there and across. Because I have to admit, I wouldn't have necessarily even thought about that prior to this role. So I think there's something about that public health message. And kind of connected to that, I suppose, my son, who was 16 at the time, went to a end of the pier type fairground and won a knife set as part of his as part of a game that he was playing, and they gave him a knife set that he then proceeded to carry around Blackpool. And some of the knives within that were huge. They were all pointy. So there's something about that kind of wider message. And I know we're kind of having those conversations, particularly now. But I absolutely agree that the majority of people think that it's zombie knives that are the big issue, not kitchen knives from their own kitchen. And then lastly, I really like the idea of police forces capturing the type of knife used with incidents, and I suppose I wonder if there's a national kind of list that this particular knife is called this and this particular knife is called that, so that actually, if at some point we're trying to look across the piece at what's going on, we're actually measuring apples and apples and not apples and pears. So I wonder if there's something there, and there may be, or that may already be in place, and I may not know, but it was just a comment, really.
Oh, great. Yeah, I don't know of any work along those lines. Do you, Toby?
I don't know. No.
But yes, it'd be nice to do that. I think there's a range of further research that'd be useful.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sharon. Nice to meet you.
And you.
Thank you, Sharon. We've got another question lined up from Leanne. Go for it, Leanne.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation. Lots to think about, lots of food for thought. I had a healthy challenge, if that's okay, on some of the statistics around what weapons are being carried. In the knife crime problem solving guide that the College of Policing put out, they found that in London in 2019 and 2020, that actually machetes, even though they're hard to source and not necessarily that available, were actually a really popular form of weapon that's carried. And also in our, the YEF puts out a children violence and vulnerability survey. And we found that when I think it was just over 10,000 children and young people we surveyed last year, and found that the most commonly carried weapons are screwdrivers or other stabbing implements, sticks or clubs, and kitchen knives. So I guess maybe just a question around, if we know a lot of children and young people are carrying weapons because they fear violence themselves and they're trying to protect themselves, if we remove the points from knives, to what extent, and I know you've spoken a little bit about that, tactical displacement, to what extent will that help those children? Are they not just going to, I'm not sure I'm fully convinced by the argument that they will stop feeling unsafe.
I think there's a difference between stop feeling unsafe and being unsafe and experiencing violence. I mean, there's a harm reduction element. You can still be involved in assault, and if it's with a less dangerous weapon, a less lethal weapon, then the harm inflicted is usually reduced. I listened to this morning, and I meant to ask Nick Madge if Jonathan Shepherd was one of the surgeons he'd worked with on Life Scientific on Radio 4, was Jonathan Shepherd, who was one of the key movers. He's professor of facial surgery at University of Cardiff. Is one of the people who moved for the introduction of less harmful glasses in pubs, plastic glasses or tougher glasses that won't break, because he was dealing with a lot of Saturday night violence of people glassing each other in the face. And it's been tremendously effective. And it's the reason I mention that is the harm reduction element. If they are using other weapons, if those weapons are not as violent, we may get the same number of incidents, but we'll get a major reduction, I would hope, in harm. I'm not sure I've fully answered your question, Leanne. I'm really interested in with the Children Violence and Vulnerability Survey. I didn't know about that data. I'm going to go and look at it. So thank you very much. Where do you work with the survey, did you say?
I work at YEF, yeah, I'm the Senior Research Manager for Policing Youth Justice, so this is super interesting. I'll pop a link to it in the chat. I think you do answer the question. It's about that harm reduction necessarily rather than incident level, like you said.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne. We also have a question from John Crichton in the chat. Is there also supportive evidence from the Scotland VRU reduction in knife crime, homicide and hospital admissions in reducing knife carrying in public? A significant fall in homicides in public places, but little effect on domestic homicides, where a different approach to kitchen knife design comes in.
Yeah, the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit is, I'm going to say, a tricky one, because it is often presented as a leading example where violence was reduced. But if you read Susan McVee's work, who's a leading Scottish criminologist, and I just reread it recently, there isn't actually evidence that what the Violence Reduction Unit did is what caused the reduction. It could have been a coincidence. There's been a general huge decline in violence, not just in Scotland, but in England and Wales and other countries. And the evaluations haven't conclusively shown that it was a Violence Reduction Unit. And I suspect that's why what would be I also haven't seen, clear explanation of what the mechanisms are by which they might reduce violence. So I'm all for alternatives if they work, but I just haven't seen, we haven't seen others that are known to work yet. That makes sense. As a summary, multi-agency working, sharing information, sharing the problem, trying to find more about it is great, but I haven't seen any conclusive evidence that other approaches work. Weapon controls work, situational crime preventions work. So I'm going with a pragmatic view. Does that really?
Thanks, Graham. And we have a question from Gary Painter, please.
Afternoon, everyone. Gary from the Kent and
Hi,
Medway
Gary.
Advanced Reduction Unit. It's something that we've really, been really passionate about, and my colleague is on here, and a few other people in the chat who've been working with as well. So we have a working group with loads of different forces at the moment, looking at how to, get the message out about rounded edge knives. So we've had ours going for about a year now, but due to politics and everything else is involved, and forces and councils not wanting to sort of put their name to anything to do with a knife replacement and bad publicity from schemes over the years, it's been quite a tricky area to navigate. So it's great that someone's actually sort of taken the time to look at it properly. If there's any sort of evaluation or anything needed on our one, we'd be happy to help with anything, or if there's any particular areas you want us to look at. Besides the in-house one, we've just we're rolling out with those Viner's knives, predominantly to households where there's sort of young people identified carrying knives, and we're looking at the domestic side of it. But we hand that over to the police, who look at that side of it for us. But anything around evaluations we can help out with. The one thing that we've always tried to work out, and we can't even from our own stats in Kent Police, is the knives. Are they ones? Have they been taken from the home and been used, or have they been brought somewhere purposely and used? We'd love to know if there's any stats around that anywhere, because if it's predominantly from the home, then we know to target one area more than the other. But anything we could do to help out with regards to the amount of their knives, we'd be here for that.
Thank you very much, Gary. That's a very generous and kind offer. I've seen, I think it was Kent and Medway. You did something a few years ago then, wasn't it? Because I've seen knife replacement schemes and was kind of really surprised to see the criticisms. And that's why I tried to give quite a lot of emphasis to the displacement arguments in our study. And I think there's a lot of evidence that they don't just result in displacement. So I was very sympathetic when I saw those and I saw the criticisms that I thought were unfair. And that's a great offer, which we'll try and take you up on it, about replacement and evaluation of them. I think you're right about knives, and are they bought from home or elsewhere, and I don't know. Are they taken from home or elsewhere? I don't know. Yeah, it's the right question.
It's part of the bit around the DA side. A lot of it's the spur of the moment type, in the household, but young people, it's hard to know, isn't it? So a lot of the families we speak to, we obviously deal with under 25s, majority under 18s, but it's what they take from home, as mums and dads are having to lock them in boxes in their cars and all this sort of stuff. But just to try, who was saying about getting the message out there? We started rolling them out unofficially into community cafes through the sort of different councils across Kent to try and get that message out more broadly around using rounded edge knives. The Royal Marines do come in and do school assemblies with us around healthy eating, and they do stuff around how knives are for the kitchen, not for the streets, and they use it and they promote it now amongst their work. So we're trying to get that message out, like you say, so not just for our replacement, but people don't know about it. They don't know what they don't know, do they? And most people don't seem to know about rounded edge knives. Sorry, just one last bit on that was, I think it was Timpson's as approach just to say about having a device in their shops where they can round people's knives. Obviously, we don't want to advertise people carrying the knives to it. So one thing we were going to look at this year was if there was a portable version, like you say, so recycling and reusing, and if people can have it done in their house, I think that's something that we'd be keen to look at as well.
Grinder will have a whole new meaning. Yes, you're exactly right. Thank you, Gary. Yes, we consider that in some of the staged implementation. Will we be deliberately rounding off knives, or how will we do it? There's a lot to work out there. That's great, and I'd love to be in touch more.
Thank you both. We've probably got time for one more question. Sharon, if you would like to just squeeze in a quick question
Yeah,
before we
just
finish?
quickly. Yeah, and I'm not sure what area it is, but there is an area in the country that are doing a publicity campaign specifically around kitchen knives being taken from homes. So they've got a knife block with a missing knife in the block, and a kind of statement that says, "Do you know where all your knives are?" Kind of targeted and focused towards parents with young people in their care. And I only came across it the other day and thought, what an amazing thing it was, actually. So yeah, I just didn't know if you'd seen that at all.
Yeah, no, I've not seen that. That's great to know. Thank you. This is it. I mean, thank you again, Sharon. Thank you to everyone. This is huge font of information. Thank you.
Well, we're coming to the end of the hour, so I think we'll wrap things up. But just wanted to finish with a huge thank you to Graham and Toby for their time and excellent presentation, and to everyone else, many of whom are on the call, for the really great work that's gone into developing this idea. And we'll wrap things up there. Thanks very much, everyone. Please do look out for future events from YF. We've got lots coming down the track.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
Peter.
everyone. Cheers.